Welcome to my review of Contra Shattered Soldier for the PS2. There's a few big differences between this game and some of the other Contra games. It's definitely a game that gets overlooked in this series, so I thought it'd be good to cover it. The Polygon Graphics are definitely a big change as far as the visuals go, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you do kind of get used to it. The change in the visual style. I do prefer the cleaner look of the old 2D sprite type of graphics, so I still prefer that, but I actually still enjoyed these. The visuals, the explosions are really nice, and good sound to complement the gunfire and explosions. The soundtrack is also pretty good, though I prefer the classic soundtrack. This game uses more like heavy metal, shit like that. It's kind of like generic heavy metal type of music. So I do prefer the original soundtrack, but I do like that they did something different just to change it up a little bit. And one key difference about this game and most of the other Contra games is that there are no power-up pickups or weapon pickups. The only way you can really change your weapons is you have 3 weapons, on you at all times, and you can switch between them. So that's how you basically manage all situations. You don't have to pick up a spread shot or anything like that. But you'll have 3 different weapons. You have a flamethrower, a machine gun, and I believe a mine thrower. And each one of those weapons has a standard, mode where you just hold the button down and it keeps firing rapid. Or you can charge the shot up. I think to charge it, you may hold down a separate button. I don't remember exactly, but when you do that, you'll use the alternate fire mode of that particular weapon that you have equipped. So each one has a unique alternate fire mode, which makes a big difference on boss fights and shit like that. You'll be switching between all 6 of those different types of attacks to manage bosses. So it's kind of interesting because you don't have to rely on picking up a dominant weapon like a spread shot that kind of carries you through the whole game like the older Contra games. In this, you have all the weapons you need on hand all the time, and you can always switch between them very quickly with the press of a button. Another interesting thing about this game is that there's really barely any platforming at all, unlike other Contra games. There's not many pits or anything that you can fall into in the game. There's also much less actual moving around, actual stages and fighting through stages. Most of the time, you're going to be fighting bosses and mini-bosses. Most of the game is composed of that. I did a video where I actually edited, all my no damage boss runs for this game, and I did most of the bosses without dying. And when I did that, it was probably about half the length of the game or more, just the boss fights. So most of the game is boss fights, which is kind of interesting. It's a different style than the other Contra games where you do fight a lot of bosses, but there's not a lot of platforming and running through the levels as much as other Contra games. So it's pretty much a game based heavily around, knowing the boss patterns, knowing which weapons to use when, where to position yourself. It's very heavily based around memorizing the boss patterns, pretty much. It's a nice mix, though. You have a lot of different types of boss fights. You got these boss fights here where you're being, chased by the boss. And then you'll be fighting it from the other side and shooting at its back. So it's a nice variety. And the weapon switching aspect, it adds a lot of depth to the game because you can find better weapons to use in different situations. If you play the game on easy, you will have a shit ton of continues. I think it's 99 continues or some shit. So you're pretty much guaranteed to beat the game if you play it on easy. But I believe the game ends early on easy. So, you may be missing some content if you play on easy. So the best way to really play is on normal, but you can play on easy just to practice the game. You can do it's a good way to practice. I started on easy just to get a feel for the layout. And then I use save and load state to practice specific sections on the emulator just to master each section. And I think I did most of the bosses with no deaths in practice. Maybe, most of them. I don't know about all of them, but I did most of them. But, if you play normal or hard, you can get the true ending by playing either normal or hard. So I recommend that. But the difference on normal and hard is it doesn't change the difficulty of the gameplay as far as I'm aware. What it does, it gives you less continues. and maybe less lives. So normal, I think you have like 3 continues. Though if I remember right, the more you play this game, the more credits you unlock. So I think at some point you can have like, a decent amount of credits by playing the game a lot. I think if you play it long enough, you may be able to unlock free play mode, where it's unlimited continues, but you still have to, beat the levels on the or beat the sections with the amount of lives that you have available. So you can't just respawn right where you died with no consequences. If you want to get the true ending and unlock an additional optional final stage and true final boss, you have to get high rankings on the levels. And I believe the way to do that was to destroy pretty much all the enemies and all the optional parts of bosses, like turrets and shit like that. If you destroy all that, I believe that gives you a higher ranking. So it's not necessarily that much more difficult to get the higher ranking, but it would take some time to learn, how to get everything destroyed. But there is that option, so there's some replayability with that. It gives good replayability if you want to unlock the additional stage and the true final boss. I didn't do that when I played through the game. I only just did normal, and I got the regular ending, which it took me a little bit over 9 hours, I believe, to do that. It's a tough game, but it's not like a real twitchy, reactive kind of game. Like a lot of the Contras, even if you had a lot of the patterns and stuff memorized, you would still have to be really good with your twitch skill in the actual levels when you were, dealing with regular enemies, because the bullets could be real fast and they could catch you off guard even when you knew the game. In this game, it's not too much like that. This game is more about memorizing patterns, and it's not really that based on twitch reflexes. Because if you have memorized where to position when these things come down, for example, you stay in the gap and you don't take any damage. And it's really just memorizing a lot of patterns that are always the same. So, in that sense, it's easier than some of the harder Contra games like Contra Hardcore. But it's still much harder than games like Contra for NES and Super C for NES, which were very simple Contra games. But, it's the kind of game where you can kind of just learn the patterns and you can pretty much master it that way. You don't have to, be able to adapt on the spot constantly. You don't have to be real good at that skill to beat this game. So it's different in that sense. I mean, now the old Contra games, most of them, you could memorize a good chunk of those games. But a lot of times when you were dealing with the regular enemies, a lot of times it would feel like you actually had to dodge shit and react to it as it was happening. And you didn't really have those scenarios memorized. Unless you were speedrunning the games, you can probably have them down to like the pixel. But if you're just playing it normally to beat it, you're probably not going to have them down to that degree, and you're going to have to actually react to what happens on screen. But this game is very learnable. As you can see, there's very clear patterns. And all you got to do is learn all the patterns for all the bosses, basically, and all the segments. And just put it together when you play the game. So it's just a matter of staying sharp as far as, what you remember from practice and putting it all together. You basically try to minimize your fuck-ups, and eventually you get it down. But yeah, what's cool is that it has you switching weapons a lot. As the scenarios are constantly changing, you're constantly switching between your flamethrower, different charge shots with your various 3 weapons. So it makes you pretty much use everything that you have at your disposal. For the most part. I think there might be some weapons that I didn't really use too much. But, I found most everything to have a use. So I thought that was well implemented. It's very well designed as far as, the patterns are pretty clear. The patterns are not too complicated or anything like that. It's just that there's a lot of them. Each boss has a lot of different moves. But they're mostly pretty simple patterns. It's just that you have to be ready to react to them when those patterns appear. And, the bosses do telegraph what they're about to do. So you have enough time to react. As long as you know how to react to each attack, you shouldn't have too much of a problem with practice putting it all together. And it's very satisfying when you do put it all together. It comes together nicely. But yeah, the bosses are usually multi-phase. So, you'll be fighting a boss and it'll probably have like 2 or 3 forms a lot of times. The bosses, a lot of them are huge. You have, occasional small bosses that are human-sized, but they usually have a lot of patterns and attacks to learn. So, I mean, the best way to approach this game is, maybe just start on easy with the 99 or 100 continues and play through that. because you'll play through a decent chunk of the game on that. I think there's a training mode, too, that lets you practice stages isolated, so you can kind of work on the game that way with, I think, unlimited lives. So that's a good way to practice. But I think the best way to practice is on an emulator using save and load states. Just save state on all the challenging sections and learn each section. Because for this game, you want to learn every section pretty much. Because each section can be very, very difficult and drain a ton of lives if you don't know exactly what to do. I still say that the game really isn't that hard because it's like a memorization game. To me, at least. I found it to be a memorization game where, and I've gone over this a lot, but games like Gunsmoke for arcade and Super Smash TV for the Super Nintendo don't really feel like you can memorize them for the most part. You feel like you're reacting to like dynamic situations, and it's intense as fuck because you feel like you could fuck up at any moment. In this game, it doesn't really feel like that. In this game, once you've learned the patterns, it's just a matter of remembering them and just executing everything cleanly. That's about it. That's really the entire game is based around that. So that's the kind of game it is, and it's probably more like that than any of the Contra games that I remember beating and playing. I never beat Contra Hardcore, but I did beat most of the Contra games. Even some of the lesser-known ones. Not the 3D ones so much. I think I beat one of the 3D Contra games on PS2, but those games, some of those were really shitty. And I barely played those, like Contra Legacy of War, shit like that. Now, you see some normal stage play here, but you can see you play the stage for a very brief amount of time, and then here comes a boss. And that's pretty much how the whole game is paced. It's a lot of times you have very small sections where you fight a few regular enemies. And those sections usually aren't that challenging, but you still need to know what's coming up. And then you're going to be fighting a mini-boss, and you're probably going to fight multiple mini-bosses in each stage, and then you'll fight main bosses at the end. And this is the end of the game. For this, it's pretty much a boss rush, as a lot of games do. And it's really just knowing, all the patterns for all the bosses. You do have to practice, though. It's not always really clear basic patterns. There are parts that you really have to practice so you know where to position yourself when a certain attack occurs and things like that. So it's not always super straightforward. But if you're using save and load states to practice, you can really learn how to position yourself and really master each encounter. And while I found the game to be challenging, I didn't think it was that difficult because it's just a matter of putting in the time to learn all the patterns. And I guess in a way it sounds like that's what most games are about, but there are quite a few old games where, you have to react kind of dynamically and, you can't just memorize them. But this game, I would say, is very, very memorizable, very much so you can just memorize, like, pretty much the whole game. But I still found it to be a very enjoyable, satisfying game to put together. I'd say it is among the best Contra games. I thought it was a great game. But you see here, it's just one boss after another. I did edit down the actual boss fights, but I show pretty much how this final part progresses. It's boss after boss with no fighting any enemies or anything. You just have one boss after another, and you have to learn them. The detailed design is actually pretty cool. The art style, like it's real fucking detailed, which is cool. I do like that. I still prefer the sprite-based visuals, of the other games, but it does have its own unique style to it. It still takes, a nice amount of time to learn all these patterns because, the game it's probably maybe 45 minutes long without the optional final stage. It's a decent length game. It might be over an hour long because what I did was I edited out deaths for the tutorial, I think. So it is one-hit deaths like most of these games, and like I said, limited continues. But it's a decently, long game, so, you do have to know what's coming up. Otherwise, your lives will drain very fast, even on very short sections. So it is a game you have to put time into and really learn. But I like that as you play it more, the game gives you more continues as you put more time into it. So eventually you'll have a few extra continues to work with. You may eventually be able to unlock free play. I don't know if I played it to that degree. You can also select whatever stage you want to start with in the beginning, so that's pretty cool. It gives it a little variety, so you're not always starting from the same first stage all the time. But yeah, overall, I'd give this game an 8.5 out of 10. It's a great game, very good game, and I definitely recommend playing it. Thanks for watching.